You know and I know everything happens in South Florida. It's a positively presidential place to play, and many have. Since the early 1800s, Florida has lured U.S. presidents before, during, and after their days in the Oval Office with promises of sunshine, fishing, relaxation, and electoral votes. Some even came to shed the blood of enemies. Andrew Jackson visited Florida before it became a state, before he became a president, and long before he ended up on the $20 bill. He fought the Spanish in 1812 and in the First Seminole War in 1817. Jackson was appointed Florida's first governor when the U.S. annexed the territory in 1821, and he hated it, especially the heat and mosquitoes. The only other president-to-be to visit Florida before statehood was Zachary Taylor with the U.S. Army to fight in the Second Seminole War. And from the look of this picture, we know how he earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready. In 1880, former President Ulysses S. Grant came to Florida to dig the first shovel of dirt for the start of the Sanford-Orlando Railroad. In 1883, President Chester A. Arthur came to South Florida to inspect the huge drainage system being built to convert the Everglades into dry farmland. Grover Cleveland was an occasional visitor to Fort Lauderdale, and when he wasn't staying with wealthy naturalist, author, and playboy Charles Corey, he was staying at the old New River Inn, which is now a museum. During the 1898 Spanish-American War, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt came to Florida as second-in-command of a boisterous brigade known as the Rough Riders. President-elect Warren G. Harding didn't know what he was getting himself into during a visit to Fort Lauderdale in January of 1921. It turns out advertising executive and promoter Commodore Allen Harcourt Brooke used his sailboat, the Clio, to rescue Harding from a yacht that was stranded on the Intracoastal Waterway near the Solace Bridge, blocked by a dredging barge that Brooke arranged. He invited Harding to play a round of golf on a course that is now Fort Lauderdale-Hollywood International Airport. A crowd of about 300 dignitaries and townsfolk just happened to be there to greet the president-elect. And the next day, an elephant would be his caddy at a Miami Beach golf course. History says Harding never suspected he was set up as the centerpiece of a celebrity encounter. Harding died 2 years later, but not of embarrassment, and Vice President Calvin Coolidge became president. A man of few words, Coolidge passed through Fort Lauderdale in 1928, and when greeted by more than 8,000 people, including a troop of Girl Scouts, his inspiring message was, "Hello, Girl Scouts." A month later, Silent Cal, as he came to be known, was supposed to push a button in Washington that would ceremoniously detonate dynamite in Broward County to open a channel from the Atlantic Ocean to what would become Port Everglades. It fizzled, though, so local engineers had to set off the charge. President Herbert Hoover, on the left, was a frequent visitor to South Florida, mostly for fishing in the Keys. Then he handed the keys to the White House to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, seated on the right. FDR planned to retire in South Florida. He wanted to buy Channel Key and build a fishing camp there, but turned down the $15,000 asking price. Pearl Harbor and World War II changed his plans. Then it seemed the only time he came to South Florida was on business.
Franklin Roosevelt flew into here incognito for his first wartime conference, 1942 in Casablanca. He came through Dinner Key. On the plane's manifest was a Mr. Jones. That was the president.
FDR would die in office in 1945, and Vice President Harry Truman took over. He made Florida his home away from home, and is seen here dedicating Everglades National Park in 1947. Truman lived in a house on the Navy's submarine base in Key West that came to be known as the Little White House. It wasn't much of a getaway, though. He had 11 working vacations on the island, but his presence put Key West on the world map. In the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy was a regular visitor at the Kennedy clan's oceanfront mansion in Palm Beach, and JFK spoke to about 40,000 people at the Orange Bowl when Cuban exiles were freed from Fidel Castro's jails following their role in the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1968, Richard Nixon was chosen as the presidential candidate at the Republican National Convention in Miami Beach. In the 70s, he had a home on Key Biscayne, where he was a neighbor of financier Bebe Rebozo. Like many presidents, Jimmy Carter campaigned through Florida. President Ronald Reagan also came to Florida to campaign and to greet world leaders.
I have met in private audience with His Holiness Pope John Paul II. We discussed the practical aspects of ideals we share, peace, justice, and the expansion of freedom.
Reagan's vice president had deeper Florida roots. President George H.W. Bush first came to Fort Lauderdale as a teenager to learn how to fly.
Former President Bush did his pilot training here when this was a Navy base, and he was actually the youngest naval aviator ever to train here. He was 18 years old at the time, as I recall.
What remains of the torpedo bomber training base is tucked away in the southwest corner of Fort Lauderdale-Hollywood International Airport. George H.W. Bush slept in barracks like this all those years ago, where he learned to fly TBM Avengers. He would go on to become our 41st president and make frequent trips to South Florida for a little fishing. His son, George W. Bush, would visit Florida too, but mostly on business, and to catch up with his governor brother Jeb Bush, and for a quick Cuban coffee, perhaps. There were plenty of President Bill Clinton sightings in South Florida on the campaign trail. Once he left office, though, Clinton had time to take in a Miami Heat basketball game. President Barack Obama was no stranger around these parts either, but it was mostly for work as well, even in the Everglades. One thing is undeniable, where presidents and Florida are concerned: there has been a big change, to coin a phrase. With another chapter of South Florida's dubious history, I'm Wayne Roustan for the Sun Sentinel.